Hey, how are you? This is your friend Dave. I hope you're doing well. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of leadership. And I've been spending time through the book of Hosea in the mornings and wanted to and some things that I had read and contemplated and thought about really just stuck with me. And as I've read through the book and kind of studied through the book, you really get to see the impact of leadership on the lives of people. And so today I want to talk about the consequences of leadership in the book of Hosea. So Hosea is a wonderful book. It's got a well known famous prostitute in it. Her name is Gomer, and it's a story, it's a narrative that parallels the unfaithfulness of Israel to the unfaithfulness of a wife to her husband, and it's set in a broader societal decay of the northern kingdom in the 8th century BCE. The text, while deeply personal in its imagery, deserves or serves as a public indictment of the leaders, the priests, the wealthy elites, and the influencers who played a significant role in leading Israel into moral and spiritual decline. By looking at these and their unhealthy motives, we can gain some insight into the devastating impact of corrupt leadership on a nation. So, Hosea ministered during the reigns of Jeroboam II, who ruled from 782 to 753 BCE, and through the final kings of Israel, leading up to its fall to Assyria in 722 BCE. This was a time of political stability and economic prosperity, especially during Jeroboam's reign. But beneath the surface, the moral and spiritual health of the nation was in free fall. And so politically, Israel was vulnerable. The Assyrians, their empire, a rising power, threatened Israel's security. And that anxiety often led to Israel's leaders seeking allegiances with foreign powers. And that frequently meant adopting that foreign power's God and their practices. This is essentially a theological syncretism, the blending of worship of Yahweh with Baal and other local deities. And that's what was condemned by Hosea, who saw it as spiritual adultery. Now, in Hosea's time, the priests were supposed to be custodians of the nation's spiritual life, ensuring that the people remained faithful to Yahweh. But many of them became complicit in leading the people astray. Hosea's indictment against the priests is very clear. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. That comes from Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, the ESV version. So the failure of the priests lay in their neglect of teaching the law of God that was supposed to guide the daily lives of the people. Instead of reinforcing the covenant relationship between Yahweh and Israel, the priests allowed or even encouraged the people to engage in syncretistic practices like the worship of Baal, which included certain fertility rites and cult prostitution. This moral and religious compromise, it diluted the nation's devotion to Yahweh and contributed to the people's spiritual confusion. Some of them didn't even have a history of a relationship with Yahweh. The priests held a position of immense influence over the moral and spiritual compass of the nation, but their unhealthy motives, whether it was greed or power or a lack of reverence for sacred duty, corrupted their leadership as they prioritized their own interests over the well being of the people. The priests became enablers of the very practices that were eroding the nation's spiritual identity. This failure had generational consequences as the moral decay they allowed to flourish affected future generations. And that led to societal instability and eventually judgment by God. In addition to the priests, the wealthy elite of Israel also played a significant role in the nation's decline. Hosea describes a society where the rich oppressed the poor, and justice was a commodity that was bought and sold. In Hosea 4:8, he says, "They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity." That statement reveals that the wealthy were not just indifferent to the plight of the marginalized, but they actively exploited them as well. One of the most insidious effects of wealth is its potential to distort a leader's priorities. And for the elite in Hosea's time, wealth was no longer a means to bless the community. It was actually a tool for maintaining power and control. The prophets consistently condemned that kind of exploitation as the wealthy lived in luxury while the poor suffered. Hosea's contemporary, a prophet named Amos, similarly rebuked the wealthy for selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. That's from Amos chapter 2, verse 6. The economic policies of the wealthy created social and societal divisions where the few at the top grew richer while the majority sank deeper into poverty. Does that sound familiar? The economic disparity, coupled with the elite's failure to use their influence for good, created a moral vacuum. Does that sound familiar? When those in positions of wealth and power prioritize self-interest over justice and mercy, the fabric of society unravels. The vulnerable are left unprotected, and the social contract, where leaders care for their people, is broken. Wealth in and of itself is not inherently evil, but when it becomes the driving force behind leadership decisions, it corrupts. The wealthy elite of Hosea's time were called to act as stewards of their resources, but what they did is they used their wealth to consolidate power and marginalize the poor. This kind of leadership deepens societal divisions and leads to the oppression of the very people they were supposed to protect. In Hosea's era, beyond the priests and the wealthy, there was another group of leaders whose impact was felt across Israel. That were the prophets and the public influencers. Prophets were supposed to speak on behalf of God, providing spiritual guidance and correcting the nation when it strayed from its covenant with Yahweh. But in Hosea's time, many prophets became false influencers, aligning themselves with the corrupt leadership of the day. Hosea describes the false prophets as the prophet is a fool, the man of the spirit is mad. That's from Hosea chapter 9, verse 7. These were individuals who had abandoned their divine calling for personal gain, using platforms to promote a message that was popular but not truthful. In a culture increasingly obsessed with prosperity and comfort, these prophets likely capitalized on the people's desire for security, offering false assurances rather than calling for repentance. Influencers today, like those in Hosea's time, wield considerable power over public opinion. Think TikTok influencers or Instagram influencers or just social media influencers in general. When those folks, motivated by self-interest or greed, choose to manipulate their audiences for personal gain, the consequences are catastrophic. horribly catastrophic. Instead of guiding people toward truth and righteousness, these false prophets lead them deeper into sin, convincing them that all is well while the moral foundation of the nation crumbled beneath them. The unhealthy motives of these influencers were driven by a desire for popularity and profit rather than a genuine concern for the well-being of the people. Does that sound familiar? Their failure to uphold the nation to hold the nation accountable for its sins and their willingness to compromise truth for acceptance exacerbated the moral decay that eventually led to Israel's downfall. Now, the unhealthy motives of Israel's leaders, whether priests, wealthy elites, or influencers, created a ripple effect that devastated the nation. Leaders have the power to shape the moral and spiritual character of their communities. Not only do they have the power to do that, they do that. When their motives are self-serving, the consequences are far-reaching and oftentimes irreversible. First, unhealthy motives distort the leader's vision. When leaders prioritize their own needs, be it wealth or power or fame, they lose sight of their responsibility to serve the people. In Hosea's time, the priests failed to maintain the nation's covenant with Yahweh because they were more concerned with maintaining their positions of power. The wealthy elite, driven by greed, used their resources to oppress rather than uplift. And false prophets, motivated by a desire for popularity, fed the people lies rather than truth. Second, unhealthy motives erode trust. A leader's credibility is built on integrity and the ability to act in the best interests of their followers. When leaders betray that trust by pursuing self-serving agendas, they damage the relationship between themselves and the people they're supposed to lead. In Hosea's time, the people of Israel could no longer trust their leaders to guide them in righteousness. This erosion of trust contributed to the societal instability of the people. This erosion of trust contributed to the societal instability as the people had no moral compass to follow. And then finally, unhealthy motives create a culture of corruption. When those in positions of leadership act unethically, it sends a message that such behavior is acceptable or even expected. In Israel, the corruption of the priests, wealthy, and the influencers, it filtered down into the broader society. People began to believe that moral compromise was necessary for survival, leading to widespread spiritual decay. Now, despite the grim picture painted in Hosea, the prophet's message is ultimately one of hope. Hosea calls Israel to repentance. He urges them to return to Yahweh and restore their covenant relationship. In Hosea 14, the prophet offers a vision of restoration, and it's actually throughout the whole book, there are pockets of this vision of restoration. He says in Hosea 14:4, I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. Hosea's call to repentance is a reminder that even in the face of corrupt leadership, restoration is possible. Leaders who have lost their way can return to a path of integrity if they acknowledge their unhealthy motives and seek to serve the people with humility and righteousness. Likewise, nations and communities that have been led astray can find healing when they return to the values of justice, mercy, and truth, because ultimately that's what God requires, right? So just to kind of sum everything up, the book of Hosea offers a sobering reflection on the impact of the impact of leadership on a nation. Priests, wealthy elites, and influencers in Israel, political powers in the United States, they had a profound responsibility to guide the people in righteousness. Some people say, well, we're not electing a pope, we're not electing Jesus, we're not electing a priest, right? But there still needs to be moral responsibility, moral and ethical frameworks within which a nation can operate. Otherwise, the foundations of that nation will crumble. And the unholy, unhealthy motives of the priests, the wealthy, and the influencers, and congressmen and senators and presidents, whether it's greed or power or popularity, that led to the nation's spiritual and moral collapse. It will lead and has led to many nations' spiritual and moral collapse. The consequences of their actions were felt not only in their own time, but in generations to follow, because it impacts not just today, but generations in many cases. Leadership is a sacred trust, and when that trust is broken, the effects can be devastating. Hosea's message, again, it's not without hope. Repentance and restoration are always possible, even in the face of corruption. By returning to the values of justice, integrity, and service, leaders can guide their communities toward healing and renewal and prosperity. Now, in today's world, Hosea's warnings remain relevant. Whether in religious, political, or social spheres, the leaders must guard against unhealthy motives that prioritize personal gain over the well being of those who are being led. And when leaders act with integrity, they create a legacy of righteousness that endures for generations. Think about that. Think about your own leadership and how it's impacting the lives of others. And do you have unhealthy motives that are impacting how you lead the organization, the state, the country, your church, even your family? If so, figure out how to seek forgiveness and submit and commit to being restored. You think about that. Have a great day.